For 12 years, I believed I was an equal partner in a marriage, but I was really just an operator in a system I didn't understand. The entire illusion collapsed on a quiet Thursday morning. Dylan didn't sit me down. He didn't even look guilty. He just casually announced that Lily and the baby were moving into our farmhouse. He wasn't asking for a compromise. He was assigning me a task. I was expected to just handle it. No discussion, no choice. Just the cold, suffocating realization that my life wasn't mine anymore. My alarm goes off at 5 a.m. every single day. It doesn't matter if it's freezing or if I'm sick or if I barely slept. The farm doesn't care, and neither did Dylan. While he was still snoring, wrapped in the warm blankets, I was already pulling on my heavy boots by the back door. And the morning air hits you like a wall of ice, but you just push through it. I'd walk out to the barn, my breath turning to smoke in the dark. The animals need feeding, the cows, the chickens. They all rely on me, hauling 50-pound bags of feed, pitching hay, mucking out stalls until my arms ached and my hands were blistered. It is grueling physical work that breaks you down piece by piece. And I did it all before the sun even fully cleared the horizon. Dylan always liked to call himself the owner of the farm, the big visionary. But a vision doesn't feed the livestock. A vision doesn't shovel manure. I did. I was the engine keeping his dream alive. By the time I walked back into the house at 7:30, exhausted and smelling like dirt, my second shift was just beginning. I couldn't even sit down. The kitchen was waiting. I'd wash my hands, tie an apron over my flannel shirt, and start cooking breakfast. Bacon, eggs, pancakes, whatever Dylan wanted. He'd finally come downstairs, pouring himself a cup of coffee I had just brewed, looking fresh and well-rested. He'd give me a quick pat on the shoulder, tell me breakfast smelled good, and then sit at the table, scrolling through his phone. After breakfast, he'd head out to do the big jobs, which usually meant driving the tractor around for an hour, or driving into town to talk to the other farmers. Meanwhile, I was left to clean up the kitchen, do the laundry, scrub the floors, and then head into the home office, because someone had to manage the reality of this place. I handled the books, every receipt, every invoice, every tax form. I tracked our expenses down to the last cent. And I also managed all the small orders, the local deliveries, the egg cartons, the vegetable crates. I answered the emails, took the phone calls, dealt with the angry customers when a delivery was late. I held the entire financial and operational structure of our lives together. My brain never stopped calculating, planning, worrying, and for years, I thought this was just what partnership looked like. I thought I was building a life with my husband. I thought my sweat and my exhaustion were investments in our shared future. But when you are in the middle of it, when you are running on empty every single day, you don't have the energy to see the truth. You don't realize that exploitation in a relationship rarely looks like a dramatic movie scene. It doesn't always start with shouting or obvious cruelty. It starts with the quiet, daily things. It starts with the repetitive tasks that no one else wants to do. It starts when your partner stops seeing you as a person and starts seeing you as a utility. I had become a function. I was the farmhand. I was the maid. I was the accountant. I was the cook. I was just a piece of machinery in the system of Dylan's life. As long as the gears kept turning, as long as his clothes were clean and his meals were hot and his farm was making money, he was perfectly happy. He never had to think about the fuel that kept it all running. He never had to think about me. And that's why he could stand in our kitchen and tell me that his sister and her newborn baby were moving in. That's why he didn't ask. You don't ask a refrigerator if it minds keeping the milk cold. You don't ask a tractor if it's too tired to plow the field. And you just expect it to work. He expected me to just absorb this massive new burden, to just add full-time nanny to my endless list of functions, without a single word of protest, because in his mind, my time wasn't mine. My energy wasn't mine. I was just there to serve the system. When Lily actually arrived at the farm, that suffocating feeling of being an employee in my own life only got worse. She didn't walk in looking apologetic or even slightly grateful that I was taking her in. She just walked through my front door like she owned the place. She didn't even look at me when she handed over her bags. There was no polite greeting, no thanking me for the massive disruption to my life. She just immediately started complaining about the dust in the hallway and demanding to know which room had the best heating. I was standing there, or in the home I built with my own sweat, feeling like a stranger who had overstayed her welcome. And Dylan, he just enabled all of it. He carried her boxes upstairs, rushing around the house like a hotel bellhop eager for a tip. But it was the little details that really started to crawl under my skin. Things that, on their own, you could easily brush off or excuse if you weren't paying close attention. But when they keep happening day after day, your brain starts trying to sound an alarm. The first real red flag was the baby's daily routine. Dylan is a man who can't even remember where he leaves his own tractor keys half the time. He doesn't know where we keep the extra paper towels in our own kitchen. But suddenly he was a childcare expert. One afternoon, the baby started crying in the living room. And I stepped out of the kitchen to help, but Dylan was already there. He picked up the baby, bouncing him in this very specific, incredibly practiced rhythm. Then he turned to Lily and said, he usually needs exactly 4 ounces around this time, right before his afternoon nap. I froze. The room went totally silent in my ears. He usually needs? How would Dylan know that? How would a man who works outside in the dirt all day know the exact feeding and napping schedule of his sister's newborn baby? When I asked him about it later at dinner, he just casually brushed it off. He claimed Lily had mentioned it on a phone call. But the way he held that baby, it wasn't the awkward, nervous fumble of an uncle trying to help out. It was deep, undeniable muscle memory. And then there was Noah, Lily's partner and the baby's actual father. You would think that during a massive transition like this, the father would be heavily involved. But Noah was practically a ghost. He wasn't in any of the family group chats. He wasn't part of any of the logistical planning for the move. Whenever I tried to bring him up to just politely ask how he was handling the separation, Lily would instantly change the subject, and Dylan would quickly jump in to defend her, saying Noah was just busy with work and needed his space. It made absolutely no sense. Noah was pushed entirely to the sidelines, while my husband was suddenly taking on the role of the primary provider and protector for this woman and her child. Dylan started spending more and more time inside the house. He used to be out in the fields until sunset, but now he was constantly finding excuses to come back inside. When he needed to help Lily set up the crib, he needed to help Lily organize the baby clothes. He needed to run to the store because Lily craved a specific brand of juice. Meanwhile, I was out there drowning. I was managing the farm completely alone, doing his heavy chores on top of my own, while he played house inside. Every time I walked past the living room window and saw them sitting together on the couch, laughing in hushed tones, a cold knot would tighten in my stomach. This is the most dangerous part of being manipulated. You feel it in your gut. You notice the lingering looks, the whispered conversations that stop the second you walk into a room, the schedules that just don't add up. You know something is deeply wrong, but you don't have the hard proof. And without the proof, you start gaslighting yourself. You tell yourself you're just being paranoid. You tell yourself you're just exhausted from all the extra farm work. Manipulators rely on that. They rely on you doubting your own intuition. They leave these tiny puzzle pieces everywhere, knowing that if you try to put them together without seeing the full picture, you'll just sound crazy to everyone else. But I wasn't crazy. I was just refusing to accept the terrifying truth those pieces were forming. It didn't happen with shouting. If he had yelled, if he had thrown a plate against the wall, I would have known how to react. But the tension in our house didn't come from noise. It grew in the absolute suffocating silence. The air in the farmhouse just started to feel incredibly thin. I was suffocating in the very rooms I had painted with my own 2 hands. Suddenly, time wasn't mine anymore. The rushed timeline of every single day became unbearable. Before Lily arrived, my mornings were grueling, but they were mine. Now, everything was dictated by the baby's schedule, which really meant Lily's schedule. Dylan would casually walk into the kitchen at 6 in the morning and say, "Olivia, you need to finish the barn chores by 7 today. Lily wants to take a warm bath before the baby wakes up, and she needs the hot water." I was expected to condense 3 hours of heavy labor into 60 minutes, just so his sister could have a spa morning in my bathtub. I was literally running across the muddy yard, my heart pounding, my chest burning, just trying to keep the invisible machinery of their lives running smoothly. And then, the physical space started to shrink. It happened so subtly at first. And it started in the living room, my favorite reading chair in the corner, pushed into a dark hallway to make room for a massive, expensive baby swing that Dylan somehow bought without asking me. Then it was the sunroom. The place where I kept my winter seedlings was suddenly cleared out because Lily needed a quiet space for her morning yoga. But the breaking point was my office. For 12 years, that small room off the kitchen was my command center. It was where I paid the bills, tracked the inventory, and kept the farm afloat. One Tuesday afternoon, I walked in to find Lily's massive designer suitcases dragged right into the middle of the floor. Dylan was moving my metal filing cabinets into the damp, unfinished basement. When I asked him what he was doing, he didn't even stop to look up. He just said, "Lily needs a proper nursery. Tell Olivia, your paperwork can go downstairs. It's not a big deal." Not a big deal? He was literally dismantling my existence in our home. But the final nail in the coffin wasn't about physical space. It was about survival. A few days later, I sat down at my laptop, shivering in the cold basement to pay the monthly feed supplier. I typed in the banking password I had used for half a decade. Access denied. I typed it again, slower this time. Error. I felt a cold drop of sweat slide down my back. I found Dylan out in the driveway loading heavy bags of feed into the truck. When I told him the password wasn't working, he didn't look surprised. He just casually wiped his hands on his jeans. "Oh, I updated the security on the accounts," he said, not even making eye contact with me. "Look, you have so much on your plate right now with the animals and helping Lily out. I'm just going to take over the finances for a while so you don't get overwhelmed." My blood ran completely cold. He wasn't helping me. He was locking the doors. That is the terrifying truth about manipulation that nobody warns you about. True control doesn't usually start with an angry man forbidding you from leaving the house. It doesn't start with chains. It starts with someone quietly, systematically, reorganizing your entire life without asking for your opinion. They frame it as a favor. They frame it as a necessity. But what they are really doing is taking away your space, your time, and your access to your own resources, one tiny piece at a time, until one day you wake up in your own house and realize you don't have the keys to a single door. And it was a Thursday afternoon. Dylan and Lily had taken the truck into town to pick up some specialized organic formula for the baby. The farmhouse was completely silent for the first time in weeks. I was in the kitchen, wiping down the wooden counters, just trying to breathe and enjoy the rare moment of absolute peace. I needed to order some medical supplies for the spring calves, but remember, Dylan had locked me out of all our main financial accounts. I walked into the living room to grab my phone to call the supplier directly, and that is when I saw it. Dylan's silver laptop was sitting wide open on the coffee table. The screen was still glowing brightly in the dim room. He had been in such a rush to play the devoted chauffeur for Lily that he actually forgot to close it. I didn't walk over there intending to snoop. I really didn't. I just wanted to use his browser to quickly check the exact price of the supplies on the website. I sat down on the edge of the sofa and touched the trackpad to wake up the screen. I didn't have to hack into anything. I didn't have to guess a complex password. The truth doesn't always require a massive, dramatic investigation. Sometimes, it just needs a tiny crack in a massive system of lies. It just takes a single moment of arrogance and carelessness from someone who thinks they are completely untouchable. His email inbox was open. Right at the top of the screen, a new message had just arrived. The sender name was Lily. But it wasn't the subject line that made my hand freeze in midair. It was the first line of the preview text. It read, "I can't wait until she is finally gone, and this is all ours." My breath caught sharply in my throat. Until she is finally gone? Who was she? Was it me? I clicked on the email. My fingers were trembling so badly I could barely double-click the mouse. I read the message, and then I scrolled down and read the one before that, and the one before that. They weren't talking about family arrangements or baby schedules. They were talking about property. They were talking about legal documents. And worse, they were talking to each other with a level of deep, sickening intimacy that made my stomach physically turn. He called her his beautiful girl. She told him how much she missed waking up next to him. I felt like the walls of my own living room were suddenly collapsing in on me. I minimized the browser window. Right there on the desktop, there was a folder simply labeled with a single period. A hidden folder hiding in plain sight. I opened it. Hundreds of photos instantly filled the screen. I clicked on the first one. It was Dylan and Lily, but they weren't standing side by side like a brother and sister. He had his arms wrapped tightly around her waist from behind, his face buried deeply in her neck. They were on a beach somewhere, a beach he told me he had gone to for a solo agricultural conference 2 years ago. I clicked the next one. They were in a hotel bed. The next one. They were kissing. My husband, kissing the woman he brought into my home under the guise of family duty. In the movies, when a woman discovers her husband's ultimate betrayal, she usually breaks down immediately. She screams, she throws the laptop against the wall, she slides down the kitchen cabinets and sobs hysterically into her hands. But if you have ever been through something like this in real life, you know that the first thing you do isn't cry. You don't scream. You just go completely, terrifyingly quiet. The world narrows down to a single, sharp point. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it echoing in my own ears, but my hands were completely steady now. The tears never came. Instead, my brain went into a state of absolute icy survival mode. The man I had served and loved for 12 years wasn't just a selfish husband. He was a predator, and he had brought his partner right into my nest. I sat there in the dead silence of the farmhouse, staring at the glowing screen, and I realized that my entire reality for the past decade had been a carefully constructed stage play, and I was the only one who didn't know I was an actor. I sat there in the silence of my own living room, the glow of the laptop illuminating the dust motes in the air. I didn't close the screen. My hands moved almost entirely on their own. I went back to the inbox. I needed to see the absolute bottom of the abyss. I scrolled past the beach photos and opened a folder labeled with a single word: logistics. There was an email chain dating back 3 years, 3 entire years. I clicked on the oldest message. It was from Lily. She wrote, "I can't wait until we don't have to hide anymore, my love." My love. She wasn't just his mistress. She was his parallel life. Every time he told me he was staying late in town to negotiate grain prices, every time he said he needed to visit his sick aunt in Denver, every single time he kissed my forehead before leaving the house, he was going to her. But the betrayal of my marriage wasn't the final blow. I kept reading. I opened an attachment labeled simply Clinic Results. It was a PDF document from a prenatal testing center. I stared at the bold black letters on the white screen. The probability of paternity is 99.9%. The newborn baby sleeping right upstairs. The baby I was supposed to be the free nanny for was his son, Dylan's son. He didn't just cheat on me. He created an entirely new family and then moved them directly into my house. He expected me to wash his illegitimate child's clothes while he played the devoted uncle. My stomach twisted violently, but I forced myself to keep scrolling. I had to know everything. And then I found the legal documents. It was an email from a law firm I didn't recognize, and the subject line was incredibly formal. Finalized transfer documents for Oak Creek Properties. Oak Creek was our farm. It was the land I had broken my back to maintain for over a decade. I opened the attached file. My eyes scanned the complex legal jargon until I found the highlighted section. Dylan had secretly transferred 30% of the farm's ownership into Lily's name. It was signed and notarized 3 months ago, right around the time he started complaining about our finances being too complicated for me to handle. 30%. He didn't just give her his heart or his time or a child. He gave her my sweat. He gave her my early mornings in the freezing barn. He gave her the blisters on my hands and the years of my youth. He was systematically dismantling my ownership of the life I had built, piece by piece. Right under my nose, he was turning me into a temporary employee who would eventually be fired from her own property. This is the thing nobody tells you about discovering a massive betrayal. The most painful truth isn't the actual event. It isn't the affair or the hidden child or even the stolen property. The absolute most painful truth is realizing that it happened a long time ago. It is the sudden, terrifying understanding that you have been living inside a ghost town for years. Every anniversary dinner, every shared laugh over a cup of coffee, every time we painted a room together, it was all completely fake. He was looking at me, smiling at me, while actively plotting my financial and emotional execution. I sat back on the sofa. The house was still perfectly quiet. Upstairs, when I could hear the faint sound of the baby waking up and crying. A few weeks ago, I would have rushed up those stairs to help. I would have exhausted myself trying to be the perfect partner. Not anymore. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. My tears dried up the exact second I saw that property deed, because in that freezing, terrifying moment of clarity, something else shifted inside me. The panic was entirely gone. It was replaced by a cold, calculating focus. The most painful truth you can ever discover usually gives you the biggest possible advantage. They thought I was just the clueless farmhand. They thought I was too busy washing their dishes and feeding their cattle to ever look up and see the guillotine hanging over my head. But now, I saw the entire chessboard. I knew every single one of their secrets. And they had absolutely no idea that I knew. I pulled a flash drive out of the desk drawer. I plugged it into the laptop. I copied the emails, the photos, the clinic results, the property deeds, the bank statements, everything. I safely ejected the drive and slipped it deep into my pocket. Outside, I heard the heavy tires of the truck crunching on the gravel driveway. They were home. I closed the browser, put the laptop back to sleep, and walked into the kitchen to wipe the counter. I was no longer their victim. I was the architect of their downfall. The front door finally creaked open. I heard the heavy thud of Dylan's boots on the wooden floorboards, followed immediately by Lily's soft, complaining voice. A few hours ago, that exact sound would have triggered my automatic wife response. I would have instinctively turned around, or asked about the traffic, and poured them both a glass of cold water. But now, as I stood there in the kitchen holding the wet dishcloth, I felt absolutely nothing. Society has a very specific, very dramatic script for what a betrayed woman is supposed to look like. We are relentlessly taught that when your heart gets completely shattered, you are supposed to shatter the plates. You are supposed to scream until your throat bleeds. You are supposed to collapse onto the floor, sobbing uncontrollably, or throw his clothes out onto the front lawn in a fit of hysterical, blinding rage. And honestly, I always thought that was exactly what I would do. I thought that if someone ever destroyed my 12 years of absolute loyalty, I would instantly burn the entire house down around us. But that is a movie myth. When the betrayal is that deep, when the deception is that massive, calculated, and systematic, Your body doesn't waste its precious energy on a theatrical performance. Your nervous system simply takes over the wheel. It flips a heavy, lead switch in the very back of your brain. The shock doesn't make you explode, it completely paralyzes you. I didn't run out into the hallway to confront them. I didn't scream his name. My silence in that suffocating moment was not a sign of weakness. It was the ultimate biological act of survival. Silence isn't defeat. Sometimes it is simply the necessary stage where your nervous system steps in to save your own life. My brain knew instinctively that if I broke down right there, if I showed them my hand and revealed the depth of my devastation, I would lose the only advantage I had left in the world. They had spent years carefully building a legal and emotional cage around me. If I rattled the bars now, they would just reinforce the locks. Dylan strolled into the kitchen. He was casually holding the plastic shopping bag full of baby formula, looking completely relaxed and perfectly content. He looked exactly the same as he did this morning, but suddenly I was looking at a total stranger. The man standing in my kitchen wasn't my partner. He was a parasite. He was a man who had cheerfully stolen my youth, my hard labor, and my property to secretly fund his hidden life. He tossed the truck keys onto the counter and let out a long, exaggerated sigh. "Man, the traffic near the clinic was an absolute nightmare today," he said, rubbing the back of his neck, playing the part of the exhausted, dedicated family man to absolute perfection. "And did you manage to get the barn organized, Olivia? Lily needs to put some extra boxes out there." My heart was beating a frantic, deafening rhythm against my ribs, but my hands were incredibly steady. I slowly rinsed the dishcloth under the running tap. I meticulously wrung out the water. I placed it neatly on the edge of the metal basin. Every single muscle in my body, every nerve ending was screaming at me to turn around and scream the truth right into his fake domestic illusion, but I didn't. I took a slow, deep breath, pulling the cold air into my lungs, and I looked him dead in the eye. "Yes." "The barn is completely finished," I replied. My voice didn't shake. It was perfectly level, perfectly flat, betraying absolutely no emotion. He just nodded, completely oblivious to the fact that his entire empire, his massive web of lies, one was currently sitting on a tiny flash drive inside my pocket. He smiled at me. A lazy, comfortable, arrogant smile. He walked over to the fridge, grabbed a cold beer, and headed straight back into the living room to join his true family. I stood alone in the kitchen, listening to the muffled sound of their shared laughter bleeding through the thin walls. There's a profound, terrifying power in not reacting. When you know the absolute worst truth about someone, and they think you are still completely in the dark. You stop being their helpless victim. You become a ghost in their machine. They thought my quiet compliance meant I was stupid. They thought my silence meant I was already broken. But they deeply misunderstood the difference between someone who is defeated and someone who is simply preparing the battlefield. I wasn't ignoring the pain. I was bottling it. I was distilling 12 years of profound betrayal into cold, hard fuel. I didn't need to throw a single plate. I was going to dismantle the entire farm piece by piece, and they weren't going to suspect a single thing until they were standing barefoot in the ashes. That night, I sat at the far end of the dinner table, pushing a piece of roasted chicken around my plate. Dylan and Lily were sitting directly across from me. They were laughing about something on his phone, their shoulders constantly brushing against each other. Just a few short hours ago, that exact sight would have completely broken me. I would have felt that familiar, desperate urge to make him look at me, to prove my worth to my husband. But now I just felt a profound, chilling emptiness. Now I reached my hand into the pocket of my jeans. My fingers traced the hard, rectangular plastic edge of the flash drive. It was so incredibly small, but it held the absolute destruction of their entire world. And right in that moment, watching them share a secret smile over their wine glasses, I experienced the most powerful realization of my entire life. We are always taught that power looks like physical strength, or shouting the loudest, or having the most money in the bank. But that is a complete lie. True, terrifying power doesn't make a sound. Power isn't about muscle. Power is asymmetric information. Power is being the exact only person in the room who can see the entire chessboard, while everyone else thinks they are still playing checkers. Dylan thought he was the undisputed king of this house. He thought he had successfully outsmarted a naive, hard-working farm wife. He relied entirely on the arrogant assumption that I was too busy, too exhausted, and too trusting to ever look behind the curtain. His entire strategy required my absolute ignorance, but he didn't know that the curtain was already lying on the floor. I watched him take a slow sip of his beer. He looked so incredibly comfortable, so unbearably smug. He truly believed he was successfully managing two separate lives, slowly draining my resources to build a cozy nest for his mistress and his illegitimate son. He had absolutely no idea that every single legal document, every hidden photo, every sickening email was currently sitting right against my leg. When you finally know the truth, the dynamic shifts instantly. You are no longer the victim of a conspiracy. You become its ultimate judge. A victim is someone who is still actively being deceived. I wasn't being deceived anymore. I was simply observing. I was studying the enemy. Lily leaned over and asked me to pass the salt. I looked right into her eyes. I didn't see a helpless new mother anymore. I saw a thief who had casually crawled into my home. I smiled, picked up the shaker, and handed it to her. "Here you go," I said quietly. My voice didn't even tremble. She thanked me without even bothering to look at my face. She thought I was just the hired help. She thought she had already won the grand prize. But she didn't realize she was sitting in a house made of dry paper, and I was holding the only match. I didn't need to confront them. Confrontation is what you do when you want someone to apologize, or when you want them to somehow change. And I didn't want Dylan to apologize, and I certainly didn't want him back. I wanted my life back. I wanted the true value of my 12 years of grueling labor. And to get that, I couldn't throw a tantrum. I had to be smarter, colder, and infinitely more patient than they could ever possibly imagine. The crying phase was officially over. The strategy phase had just begun. The next morning, I woke up before the sun, just like I had done for 12 years. But when I looked out the kitchen window at the sprawling green pastures, I didn't see my home anymore. I saw a massive, complex mathematical equation. I saw assets. Dylan thought he had completely outsmarted me by secretly transferring 30% of the farm's legal ownership to his mistress. He thought locking me out of the primary checking account meant I was entirely helpless. But he forgot one very crucial, very fatal detail. He might have played the role of the visionary owner, but I was the operations manager. I held the physical titles to the heavy machinery. My name was explicitly listed as the primary seller on our livestock breeder accounts. He didn't just lock me out. He left me alone with the actual inventory. When most people imagine getting back at a cheating partner, they picture something loud and explosive. They picture setting a closet full of expensive suits on fire or throwing a brick through the windshield of a truck. But that isn't true power. That is just a temporary, desperate release of anger. And anger is messy. Anger leaves evidence. A smart, devastating counterattack is completely silent. It doesn't look like a dramatic movie scene. Not it looks like a woman quietly sitting at her kitchen table drinking black coffee and writing down a very precise list of phone numbers. I wasn't interested in revenge. Revenge is what you seek when you want to hurt someone else. I simply wanted to reclaim ownership of my own life. I wanted every single drop of sweat I had poured into this soil back in my own pocket. I started with the livestock. On Monday morning, while Dylan and Lily took the baby to town for a supposed pediatrician appointment, I made my first phone call. I called Marcus, the regional cattle broker we had worked with for years. I didn't cry. I didn't sound desperate or rushed. I used my absolute calmest, most professional business voice. I told him we were unexpectedly downsizing our operations before the winter season. Then I offered him our entire herd of premium Angus heifers at a 20% discount for an immediate cash transfer. Marcus was thrilled. He agreed to send his transport trucks to the back pasture gate by the end of the week. Next was the heavy machinery. The tractors, the balers, the commercial seeders. These were the literal engines of Dylan's massive ego. I found the original physical titles in my downstairs filing cabinet. The cabinet he had so arrogantly banished to the damp basement to make room for his new family. I called an equipment liquidator 3 counties over. I told them my husband was looking to upgrade our entire fleet next spring, so we needed everything cleared out of the main sheds by Friday afternoon. The liquidator wired the funds directly into a secure, completely separate bank account I had quietly opened under my maiden name just 2 hours earlier. The most surreal part of dismantling a 12-year marriage isn't the logistics. It is the terrifying ease with which you can maintain a perfectly normal facade. That evening, I stood at the stove frying pork chops, the heavy iron skillet sizzling over the flame. Dylan walked in, complaining about the price of diesel fuel, completely unaware that the tractor he drove that morning was legally sold 3 hours ago. I smiled at him. I asked him if he wanted extra gravy on his potatoes. I washed his plates. I folded his laundry. Every single normal domestic action became an incredibly thick layer of armor. They say the winner isn't the person with the most strength, but the person with the most patience. When I was watching my husband eat the dinner I cooked, sitting in a house he thought he controlled, while I systematically drained the entire financial blood from his empire, he thought I was just the quiet, obedient farmhand. He didn't realize I was already packing the parachute, and he was the one about to be pushed out of the plane. The hardest part of burning a fake life down to the ground isn't striking the match. It's smiling warmly at the people who are standing in the room while you quietly pour the gasoline. Wednesday morning arrived with a thick, freezing fog. It was exactly 5 a.m., and the sun wasn't even up yet. The farmhouse was dead silent. Dylan and Lily were fast asleep upstairs, completely wrapped in their cozy, stolen delusion. I slipped out the back door, wearing my heavy boots, and walked down to the far south pasture. Marcus, the cattle broker, was already waiting at the gate with 3 massive, heavy-duty transport trucks. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. I just unlocked the iron gate and helped his men herd my entire premium Angus stock up the wooden ramps. I stood in the freezing, ankle-deep mud and watched the breath of the animals turning to white smoke in the cold air. By 7:30 a.m., the trucks were gone. The pasture was completely, eerily empty. I pulled my phone out of my jacket pocket. A notification was glowing brightly on the screen. A massive 6-figure wire transfer had just successfully cleared into my new private bank account. When Dylan finally woke up 2 hours later, he didn't even look out the back window. He just sat at the kitchen island and asked me to make him a cup of coffee. Thursday afternoon was exactly the same. Dylan announced he was taking Lily into town to shop for organic baby food and look at new curtains for the nursery. The second their truck disappeared down the long gravel driveway, the equipment liquidators arrived. They operated like an absolute military unit. Within 45 minutes, they hitched up our 2 main John Deere tractors, the commercial seeder and the heavy-duty baler. Watching that heavy machinery roll away down the dirt road, it was like watching my heavy, suffocating chains finally being cut one by one. The farm was completely hollowed out. But the absolute hardest part wasn't liquidating the massive farm assets. The hardest part was packing up my own soul. You can't just pack a giant suitcase and walk out the front door after 12 years of marriage. Suitcase would instantly trigger an alarm. So I had to become a ghost. I used brown paper grocery bags. I used empty cardboard feed boxes. Every single time I went into town to run mundane errands for Lily, I took a tiny piece of my life with me. I took my birth certificate, our original marriage license, and my grandmother's silver necklaces. I packed away my heavy winter clothes, my favorite books, the small, irreplaceable, sentimental things I had quietly gathered over a decade. I drove straight to a cheap, windowless storage unit I had rented on the very edge of town, unloaded the bags in the dark, and then went to the local supermarket to buy their milk and their fresh eggs. It was an exhausting, terrifying double life. One evening, Lily actually caught me putting a large stack of my heavy winter coats into a black trash bag in the hallway. My heart completely stopped. She looked at the bag and then looked right at me. "What are you throwing away?" she asked, her voice dripping with that usual annoying entitlement. I didn't panic. I just smiled, smoothed down my apron, and looked her right in the eyes. "Oh, just decluttering. I want to make sure you and the baby have plenty of closet space for the winter." She actually smiled back. She thanked me for emptying my own closets for her. That is the absolute truth about winning a war of betrayal. Victory doesn't come from a massive, dramatic explosion. It doesn't come from screaming matches in the kitchen or throwing plates against the wall or demanding a dramatic confession from a liar. It comes from hundreds of tiny, our invisible steps that absolutely nobody else sees. It comes from the quiet, agonizing discipline of acting perfectly normal while your entire nervous system is screaming on high alert. I sat at the dinner table on Friday night. It was my last night in that house. I served them roasted chicken and mashed potatoes. I listened to Dylan talk enthusiastically about his grand plans for the spring harvest. He was confidently talking about planting soybeans in the lower fields that he no longer had the machinery to plow, using money he no longer had in the bank to support a fake family that was about to completely implode. I just nodded, smiled, and poured him another glass of ice water. The winner in any betrayal isn't the person with the most power or the loudest voice. The winner is the person who can sit at a table with their enemies, eat a hot meal, and patiently wait for the clock to strike 0. I was parked about half a mile down the county road, sitting quietly in the passenger seat of Noah's dark sedan. We were safely hidden behind a thick, overgrown row of oak trees, but we had a perfectly clear, unobstructed view of the main driveway. It was Saturday afternoon. The sky was an incredibly bright, unyielding blue. We sat there in complete, heavy silence, just waiting for the final act to begin. Finally, the familiar, aggressive rumble of Dylan's heavy diesel truck broke the quiet. He turned off the main highway and started driving up the long gravel road toward the farmhouse. He was probably expecting the warm smell of a hot lunch waiting for him. Then he was definitely expecting me to immediately come out to the front porch, smile politely, and help Lily carry the heavy diaper bags inside. But there was absolutely no one on the porch. The house was completely dark and entirely still. The truck rolled to a stop near the back door. Dylan hopped out of the driver's side with his usual arrogant swagger. Even from that distance, I could see the exact moment his brain completely failed to process his new reality. He didn't look at the house first. He looked straight at the massive metal sheds near the south pasture. The heavy rolling doors were left wide open, swaying gently and loudly in the afternoon breeze. The massive green tractors were gone. The commercial balers were gone. He actually dropped the plastic grocery bags right there in the dirt. When he started jogging frantically toward the lower fields, the fields that were supposed to be completely full of our premium Angus cattle, but the rolling green grass was just empty. There was no movement, no sound of grazing, absolutely nothing but the wind. He stood there by the wooden fence, spinning around in circles like a confused, panicked child. Lily slowly got out of the truck, clutching the baby tightly against her chest, looking around nervously at the deserted landscape. Dylan ran back past her, practically tearing the kitchen door off its hinges as he rushed inside. We couldn't hear the specific words being yelled inside, but I knew exactly what they were finding in those rooms. They were finding a meticulously cleaned kitchen, completely stripped of my cast iron pans, my grandmother's wooden recipe boxes. and every single thing that made that building a home. They were finding the downstairs basement completely cleared of every financial document, every property deed, every piece of paper that proved his grand agricultural empire ever existed. He probably tried to log into the bank accounts right then and there, only to find empty balances and closed authorizations. A few agonizing minutes later, Dylan burst back out onto the front porch. He was clutching his cell phone, desperately swiping at the screen, aggressively holding it up to his ear. My old phone, sitting dead on the dashboard right in front of me, remained completely silent. I had permanently disconnected the number that morning. He started pacing back and forth across the wooden deck, waving his arms wildly in the air, shouting aggressively at Lily. She was physically shrinking back against the brick wall, clutching his child, looking absolutely terrified of the man she foolishly thought was her wealthy, untouchable protector. This is the absolute most painful way a manipulator can lose control. It isn't being caught in a dramatic, screaming argument. It isn't being handed an angry ultimatum. The most agonizing, devastating defeat is when they suddenly realize they never actually had the control they were so incredibly proud of. Dylan had spent months carefully plotting to steal my hard work and quietly replace me. He truly thought he was playing a brilliant, flawless game of chess against a totally blind opponent. He thought he was the ultimate puppet master. But as he stood there on that empty porch, looking at his barren, worthless property, he finally realized the terrifying truth. I didn't just walk away from his twisted game. I took the entire board with me. The massive system he built to exploit my labor had completely, irreversibly collapsed in less than 48 hours, and he was left completely alone, standing empty-handed in the absolute ruins of his own breathtaking arrogance. The most dangerous illusion a manipulator holds is the absolute certainty of their own control. Dylan had spent 12 years building a massive, intricate system designed entirely to keep me beneath him. He controlled the daily schedules. He controlled the bank accounts. He truly believed he controlled my perception of reality itself. On Saturday afternoon, the sky was a heavy, suffocating gray. I wasn't waiting for them on the front porch with a hot cup of coffee. I was sitting quietly inside Noah's car, parked discreetly behind a thick row of pine trees at the far edge of the property line. Noah hadn't said a single word since I picked him up from his tiny apartment in town. We both just sat there in the tense silence, staring at the long gravel driveway, waiting for the grand illusion to finally shatter. At exactly 3 o'clock, Dylan's heavy diesel truck pulled onto the property. He was driving entirely too fast, throwing loose gravel into the air, eager to get back to his stolen kingdom. He parked right next to the kitchen door. Lily stepped out first, carefully unbuckling the baby from the car seat. Dylan walked around the back of the truck, stretching his arms, looking out over his domain with that familiar, sickening arrogance. But his eyes didn't stop on the house. They drifted toward the lower south pastures, the fields where our premium herd of Angus cattle usually grazed. The fields were completely, utterly empty. Just long, unbroken stretches of silent green grass. He physically stumbled forward, squinting hard, desperately trying to make sense of the absolute void. He dropped the heavy diaper bag. It hit the dirt with a dull thud. He started running toward the large equipment sheds. The massive rolling doors were wide open, exposing the bare, oil-stained concrete floors, the tractors, the balers, the commercial seeders. Every single piece of it was gone. The heavy machinery that served as the beating heart of his agricultural empire had vanished into thin air. Lily was calling his name, her voice tight with confusion and panic, but he completely ignored her. He sprinted back toward the farmhouse, throwing the front door open so hard it violently cracked against the exterior siding. We couldn't see him inside the house, but I knew exactly what he was discovering in those rooms. He was finding my empty closets. He was finding the cleared-out filing cabinets. He was finding the kitchen stripped completely bare of every single plate, Every spoon, every memory of the woman he thought was permanently chained to his stove. Less than 2 minutes later, he burst back out onto the porch. His face was entirely red. He was frantically swiping at his phone, pacing aggressively back and forth across the wooden deck. He held the phone to his ear, his shoulders incredibly tense, waiting for me to answer. But my old cell phone was already sitting at the bottom of a public dumpster. And he started yelling at Lily. He was waving his arms wildly, pointing aggressively at the empty fields, his voice echoing across the silent farm. Lily was backing away from him, clutching the baby tightly to her chest, her face pale with terror. She had happily moved into my house to play the role of the pampered queen. But now, she was trapped on an abandoned piece of dirt with a man who had absolutely nothing left to his name. When you dismantle a manipulator's world, you don't need to shout. You just need to quietly remove the foundation they built on your back. The absolute most painful, devastating way for someone to lose control is when they realize they never truly had it. Dylan thought he was the master of the board, but as he stood there, surrounded by the absolute ruins of his own arrogance, he finally understood the terrifying truth. I didn't just walk away from his twisted game. I took the entire board with me, and he was left completely alone, playing against a ghost. Noah and I didn't rush. We opened the car doors and walked slowly down the long gravel driveway. The sound of our footsteps was steady, entirely calm against the backdrop of Dylan's frantic yelling. He was still standing on the wooden porch, his face bright red, clutching his useless phone. When he finally saw us walking out of the shadows of the tree line, he froze completely. His mouth hung slightly open. He looked at me, and then he looked at Noah walking right beside me, and the last remaining pieces of his delusion finally shattered. I know exactly what he was expecting in that moment. He was expecting a massive, hysterical wife. And he was bracing himself for a screaming match. He wanted me to cry, to demand answers, to ask him why I wasn't enough for him. Manipulators absolutely love arguments. They thrive on the chaos, because as long as you are screaming at them, you are still engaging with them. As long as you are fighting, they still have a hook inside your chest. But I didn't have a single tear left to cry. I walked right up to the bottom step of the porch and just looked at him. Noah didn't say a single word to Dylan. He just looked past him, locking eyes with Lily, who was still cowering near the front door. Noah's expression wasn't angry. It was just incredibly hollow. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a small white envelope, and tossed it onto the wooden deck at her feet. Custody papers. And he didn't yell at the woman who had lied to him for 3 years. He just turned his back on her. Then Dylan looked down at me. His chest was heaving. He tried to puff himself up, trying to summon that old, familiar authority. "Olivia, what the hell have you done to my farm?" he demanded. His voice was shaking violently. I didn't raise my voice at all. I didn't need to. I pulled the small silver flash drive out of my pocket and placed it gently on the wooden railing. "Everything you need to know is right there, Dylan," I said quietly. "The bank transfers, the equipment receipts, the cattle broker contracts. It is all perfectly legal. I also included your clinic results and your secret property deeds. Oh, and the divorce papers have already been filed in town this morning." He panicked. He started stammering and frantically trying to build a new lie right there on the spot. "Olivia, wait, you don't understand. Lily and I, we just made a mistake. The farm, we can fix this. We can talk about this." He was begging me to argue with him. He was begging for a negotiation. But I just shook my head. This is the most important thing you will ever learn about walking away from a toxic situation. The truth isn't something you say to start a debate. You don't speak the truth to convince a liar that they are wrong. You speak the truth to end the conversation. The person who is truly deeply finished with you doesn't need to scream. They don't need the last word. They don't need you to admit your guilt or apologize for your sins. They just walk away and absolutely never come back. I didn't wait for his excuse. I didn't look at Lily. I just turned around and walked back down the gravel driveway with Noah. I left my husband standing on the porch of an empty house, holding a useless flash drive, surrounded by the absolute silence of his own destruction. It has been exactly 1 year since I walked down that long gravel driveway. I don't live on a sprawling agricultural estate anymore. I live in a modest 2-bedroom apartment on the quiet side of town. The wooden floors squeak a little bit when I walk into the kitchen, and the view out of my living room window is just a brick wall and a small, struggling maple tree. But when I wake up in the morning, the air in these rooms doesn't feel thin or suffocating. It feels incredibly, wonderfully light. I don't have an alarm clock screaming at me at 5 in the morning. I don't pull on heavy, mud-stained boots in the freezing dark. When I open my eyes now, the day belongs entirely to me. I walk into my small kitchen and I make exactly 1 cup of coffee. I don't cook massive platters of bacon and eggs for a man who treats me like a household appliance. I don't manage complex financial spreadsheets just to keep someone else's massive ego afloat. The silence in my apartment isn't tense, and it isn't terrifying. It is the absolute most beautiful sound in the entire world. People sometimes ask me if I miss the farm. They ask if I deeply regret leaving behind the land I poured my youth and my absolute soul into for 12 long years. And the honest truth is, no. Not for a single fleeting second. Because what I lost was just dirt and wood and a broken system. But what I got back was my actual life. Dylan and Lily couldn't keep the property running. Without the heavy machinery, without the premium livestock, and without my daily grueling labor holding the pieces together, the entire massive operation completely folded in less than 6 months. The bank eventually foreclosed on the remaining debt he couldn't pay. He tried to call me a few times from unknown numbers, leaving desperate, angry voicemails, but I never even listened to them. I just pressed delete. I took the money from the liquidation and I invested it quietly. I started a small consulting business for local agricultural vendors. I am sleeping a solid, uninterrupted 8 hours every single night. Society tells us a very specific story about recovering from trauma. They tell you that healing means eventually forgetting what happened to you. Then they insist that time heals all wounds, and one day you will just wake up and the massive betrayal will be completely erased from your memory. But that is a complete lie. You never actually forget. I still remember the exact cold, terrifying feeling in my stomach when I opened his laptop. I still remember the exact arrogant tone of his voice when he told me his sister was moving in. Healing isn't amnesia. Healing simply means that the memory no longer controls your nervous system. It means that when you think about the person who tried to systematically destroy you, your heart doesn't start racing. Your hands don't shake. You just feel a deep, quiet, unshakable indifference. I didn't get my 12 years back. You can never rewind the clock and unlove someone who didn't deserve it. But the exhausted, a terrified woman who used to stand at that farmhouse stove, desperately trying to earn her own place in her own home. She doesn't exist anymore. I left her behind on that empty wooden porch, and the woman who sits here now, drinking her coffee in this quiet little apartment, is someone they could never, ever manipulate. She is awake, she is safe, and she is finally, completely free. People often ask me if taking everything was just an act of bitter revenge. They hear the story about the empty fields, the missing tractors, the cleared-out bank accounts, and they assume I was operating out of pure spite. They think I wanted to ruin him just to make him suffer, but they don't understand the psychology of true betrayal. Revenge is loud. Revenge is when you slash someone's tires in the middle of the night, or scream their secrets to the entire neighborhood. Revenge means you still care deeply about how they feel. It means you are still desperately trying to force them to acknowledge your pain. But that completely empty farmhouse wasn't revenge. It was a verdict. It was the final, undeniable sentence handed down to a man who thought he was entirely above the law of consequences. Dylan didn't just want a wife. He wanted an ecosystem. He wanted a perfectly functioning system where I was the engine, and he was the master. He wanted the prestige of the massive farm, the clean clothes, the hot meals, and the financial security I provided, all while secretly funneling the fruits of my labor to his hidden family. He wanted to keep the benefits of my existence while completely erasing my humanity. So, I simply gave him exactly what he asked for. I removed my humanity from his property. I removed my sweat, my time, my assets, and my care. When he walked into that incredibly quiet, stripped-down house, he wasn't looking at my anger. He was looking at his own reflection. The absolute emptiness of that farm was the exact physical representation of what he actually brought to our marriage. Nothing. Without my labor. His grand vision was just an empty dirt lot. The empty house was the judge, the jury, and the executioner. It told him, louder than I ever could, that a parasite cannot survive when the host finally decides to walk away. But the most profound shift didn't happen to him. It happened to me. When you leave a deeply toxic, manipulative situation the right way, you don't just leave the abuser behind. You leave an entire version of yourself behind. For 12 incredibly long years, I genuinely believed my only value was what I could produce. I thought I was a good wife because I could haul 50-pound bags of feed in the freezing rain. I thought I was worthy of love because I could manage complex spreadsheets and keep his entire world spinning. I had completely fused my identity with my utility. Walking out of that kitchen door for the final time, leaving my faded apron folded on the bare counter, leaving my heavy, mud-stained boots by the back step, it felt like stepping out of a suffocating prison uniform. I wasn't just divorcing Dylan. I was divorcing the desperate, exhausted woman who thought she had to literally break her own back to earn a tiny scrap of basic respect. I was leaving behind the Olivia who accepted the bare minimum and called it a loving partnership. That old version of me had to die in that farmhouse so I could finally breathe. She was incredibly strong and she survived unimaginable exhaustion. But she didn't know how to live. She only knew how to operate. When I drove away that afternoon, I left her there with him. Let him keep the ghost of the woman he used. The woman who drove away down that gravel road didn't belong to the farm, and she definitely didn't belong to Dylan. If I had stayed and fought him, if I had begged him to go to counseling or cried on the kitchen floor, I would have dragged that broken version of myself into the future. By packing up my assets in total silence and letting the entire system instantly collapse, I severed the cord completely. The empty house was my final statement to him, but it was my absolute liberation for myself. And it was the exact moment I stopped being a function and finally became a person again. I know that someone is listening to this right now sitting in a quiet room, or maybe in their car parked outside a house they don't want to go into. You are listening to my story, but you are really thinking about your own. You are thinking about the sudden schedule changes. You are thinking about the passwords that were suddenly updated, the hushed conversations that stop the absolute second you walk into the kitchen. You are thinking about how your own home has slowly turned into a place where you constantly feel like you are walking on eggshells, just waiting for the next unreasonable demand. And you are exhausted. You are so incredibly tired of making up excuses for someone who is quietly and systematically dismantling your reality. I want to tell you something that nobody ever says when they give relationship advice. You do not have to leave today. Not everyone is ready to pack their bags the very first moment they realize they are being used. It takes time to process that kind of massive betrayal, especially when your entire life, your finances, and your whole identity are completely tied to that person. But while you don't have to leave right this second, you absolutely have the right to wake up. You have the right to stop lying to yourself. You have the right to look at the tiny puzzle pieces and finally admit what terrifying picture they are forming. The hardest step is never walking out the front door. The hardest step is simply looking at the person sitting across from you at the dinner table and silently acknowledging exactly who they really are. Well, once you do that, the illusion is permanently broken. You stop being their blind victim and you start becoming the architect of your own future. You stop trying to fix a machine that was specifically designed to break your back. You start quietly taking back your power, one tiny invisible piece of information at a time. Do not let them convince you that your intuition is just paranoia. Trust that cold, heavy feeling in your gut. If my story resonated with you, if you are currently living in a house that feels more like a complex system of control than an actual marriage, I want you to know that you are not crazy. You are not alone. And there is a real way out when you are finally ready to take it. Please share your own story in the comments below. Write down the red flags you ignored, the moments you finally saw the truth, and the steps you took to get your freedom back. Let this be a safe space where we can actually tell the truth without fear or judgment. Reading someone else's experience might be the exact wake-up call another woman desperately needs today. If you found any value or strength in this video, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. I will be sharing more stories, more strategies, and more hard truths about reclaiming your life from the people who try to steal it. Remember, an empty house isn't the end of your story. It is just the blank page where your real life finally begins.